Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce two distinguished guests today to you, both of them not with a legal background, but with the most interesting background. I will go a little bit more into detail in a minute. The reason why they are with me today in this podcast is that they wrote a book together with the very interesting title, The Pandemic Within, that is going to be published in the next month or so. So early summer is probably the date when you can buy it in the bookshops. It will be published in via Policy Press, via the COVID-19 series of Policy Press. And it has been written by, on the one hand, Barbara Prainsack, and on the other hand, Hendrik Wagenaar. Barbara Prainsack, for the very few who don't know her, is a professor of political sciences at the University of Vienna. She is in particular professor for comparative policy analysis and head of department at the University of Vienna in the Faculty of Social and Economic Sciences. Her research interests are in particular health policy, practices, institutions, and politics of solidarity, political, social, and ethical aspects of personalized medicine. This is one of the reasons why she and me, we know each other for many years now already. Data-rich practices in science and medicine, regulation of DNA technologies and medicine and forensics, comparative science and technology policy. Before coming back to Vienna, she is an alumna of the University of Vienna, by the way. She studied political science at the University of Vienna. Before returning to Vienna in 2017, she held several distinguished academic positions all over the world in the last years between 2013 and 2017 as a professor at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine in King's College London. Barbara and I had the privilege to start with her in Vienna. So our inaugural lectures were held together, and that's one of my really, really positive memories of the start in Vienna. And since then, I had the pleasure to work with her in different settings. In particular, and that's worth being mentioned here, in particular, Barbara is head of one of the so-called research platforms that were established at the University of Vienna in January 2020. The title of this research platform is Governance of Digital Practices. So for this reason, because Barbara is leading this and I'm one of the members there, for these reasons, we are in very close contact from an organizational point of view, but also from an academic point of view when it comes to content. And I'm really excited about this possibility to exchange opinions with her on a more or less weekly or even daily basis in some cases on what the experiences might be and the learning lessons might be that we need to take from this crisis. Just to mention one of the very many third mission activities that Barbara is responsible for. She is now for many years has been a member of the Austrian Bioethics Commission since 2009. And she has also served as a member of the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies. That's a consultancy body advising the European Commission. Since 2017, she's also an elected foreign member of the Danish Royal Academy of Sciences and Letters. So that might be just one of the many symbols that I could cite here, showing that she's really well-read and well understood all over in the world. Hendrik Wagenaar is, from his background, interestingly, in his basic qualification, psychologist. So he holds a BA and an MA in psychology. He also holds a PhD in urban studies. Currently, he is a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Vienna. At the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna. He's an adjunct professor at the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra. And he is a senior academic advisor at the International School for Government at King's College London. He also served at different universities, in particular in the Netherlands and in the UK, several years as a professor of urban studies and planning at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning of the University of Sheffield, might be mentioned here as one of many examples. He is a fellow of the British Royal Society of Arts, and he was also one of those receiving a prize for the best article written in the American Review of Public Administration. Several other awards in the field mentioned that should be mentioned here, but I will not do this now in detail due to timing reasons. Many institutional responsibilities, in particular, one to be mentioned here is he is a member of the editorial board of the journal Administrative Theory and Practice, and several other institutional and editorial councils. So good to have you both here. The first question going to both of you is, what is this book and what is the title about?
Barbara, you want to kick off?
No. So
okay, I have to kick off.
Well, I can, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Nicolaus, first of all, for having invited us in your illustrious series of podcasts, and we're very happy. And second, for your kind words about our crimes and misdeeds of the past. Yes, why this book? There's, for me personally, many reasons actually, and then professionally also some reasons. So let me try to keep it brief. Personally, I was at some point despondent early on after the pandemic started, by all these stories that we had to get back to the new normal. You don't hear that so much anymore, but at the time this was the rallying cry almost of every politician. Well, we felt, and not only us, many people with us, that the normal was what got us into trouble in the first place. So this is by now a truism, but at the time it wasn't. So Barbara and I talked about this. Our breakfasts are often kind of seminars to start the day. And slowly the idea came about to maybe write something about it. I'll come to that in a minute. My other personal despondency was that less and less I began to see to which political party I would bring my vote. So in March, coming up in March in the Netherlands, I still vote in the Netherlands, although I live in Austria. We have national elections, and I haven't the foggiest idea what party I will vote for. So the Social Democrats have disqualified themselves years ago when they took their neoliberal turn, as in so many countries. And the Greens, for whom I voted for a long time, have become completely co-opted into Dutch coalition politics and have lost every critical edge, even their green edge, I would say. So, and I think this is a serious problem, because the problems we are facing in our world, we will go into that later, no doubt, are very serious. And and this is not just a personal problem, obviously, but I hear many people talk like this. Also, opinion polls show it. Professionally, but maybe we should go into that later. Since I retired, because you forgot to mention that, but all those institutional affiliations are just to make sure that I don't get depressed.
I did forget it. I didn't mention it on purpose because I didn't know how you wanted to deal with it.
So. No. Well, now you know. So officially, I'm retired, but I'm still very active, obviously, and I'm a trained policy scholar. And within my own field, I also began to feel that what I read, what is published, is becoming more and more irrelevant to the problems that we are facing in the world. And this is a discipline that is supposed to be applied and concrete and produce usable knowledge. So these were a couple of reasons that for me were important in at some point deciding to write about it. And what we wrote, we can talk about that again later, in first instance was a series of blogs. And the blogs then turned into the book. And so that's bit of the genesis of it all.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I find the book already very interesting, because in at least in my discipline, which is law, the typical target group of articles or of books that we write are other legal professionals, in the sense of we want to find some kind of system in the existing law, and we want to explain to other lawyers how this system works and why this or that would be the right interpretation of the law. The book that I read in your case is in a way also obviously an academic work, I would assume, targeting other academics in its analysis about what's going on, but it's also a kind of call for action into the political system. Yeah. Is this something which is weird in your profession, or would you call this as the typical approach?
No. It's very weird. If I may quote you here. Yeah. No, in fact, I could only write this because I'm retired. Because otherwise I would be caught up in the British system. I was at the British University, as you said, Sheffield. I would be caught up in the research excellence framework and churning out 8,000 words articles. I still do that, but not so much anymore. But somehow getting out of that system felt in my case, as a complete liberation, an act of liberation, and I loved writing for a larger audience. So the audience we aim for is actually not so much the professionals, but the interested, educated reader. So I sometimes say to my British friends, think of the Guardian reader, but you could, also think of the reader of the Zeit, or people who are interested in common affairs and like to spend some of their attention and time on getting knowledgeable about it.
Yeah.
And also, and this you mentioned the imperative to action, is that a third despondency I have is that we're all hurtling towards a climate catastrophe, and this is, it's no longer 5 before 12, but it's at least 3 minutes past 12. And what are we doing about it? It's only the young generation, and sometimes a very young generation, that are serious about this. And so for me, that is also a statement that I take that generation very seriously, and I want to support them, because I don't think it will come from politics and I certainly don't think it will come from the corporate sector.
Yeah. Barbara, I think for you, the situation is a little bit different, because you are still in the middle of the academic system, asking you to put out 8,000 words articles probably, and you are evaluated by all this, as many of the academics are. But I see in your writing a tendency, and I think you even said that in an interview that I heard from you, also that you are addressing more and more an audience which is not not only the academics and your core peer group. It's getting broader and broader what you're writing. And why is this? And is this book just one step in this journey, or is it the final one, and you're planning to go back to academia in the classical sense after this?
I think there's not an easy answer to that. In this instance, I felt that I didn't have a choice. I think as someone who has the privilege, and I don't mean this in the sort of, it's not a phrase when I say this, I mean literally, who has the privilege of working at the university in times like these, cannot really hide behind doing merely academic work in the strict sense of the word. However, I have a very different sort of genesis from Henk. I spent almost 10 years working at King's with my colleague and friend Nicholas Rose, who is one of the big academics and scholars of governmentality, the analysis of neoliberalism and many, many other things, who never sort of taught us, I guess, to not see the research part of our academic life as separated from the rest. So I would say that I've become more radical in the sense that I don't think we should put one into a bucket which is very different from everything else. Having said that, I do not consider this book as a research monograph. So this is not a book that, you know, emerged out of a research project where I had a research question, then I went out to gather data and then I analyzed them. I've done this as well, and I will keep doing that. And in fact, as you know, of course, Nikolaus, because you have kindly invited us to talk about these projects already on Ars Boni. So we are carrying out those research projects, which, you know, gather empirical data on how people deal with the crisis. This book is something that is sort of sits on top of that. It's a manifesto type book. It's informed by our research, Henk's and mine, and colleagues who have generously shared their ideas with us, but it's not a research monograph as such. So I think it sits somewhere in the middle. I think in times as these, we have to be also normative as academics. And I know that some people look down on these types of outputs and people who spend their time on those outputs, but I think it's important. And I mean, as long as we still do the academic stuff in the more narrow sense of the word as well, which I don't intend stopping, I don't need to sort of justify it.
Yeah.
And I'm saying this in an institutional sense. If I did only those types of books, I think somebody could legitimately ask, you know, where's your research articles and research monographs? But I try to do both, which is not easy because we have all worked too much in the last couple of months.
Yeah, but that's already very interesting, Barbara, because I think when you're saying that somebody could rightly ask you, where are your research papers, if you weren't willing to write them any longer, that's already a very normative approach, or you are following a very normative approach about what a scholar or an academic should or should not do in the 21st century. And I mean, one of my personal lessons of this whole crisis is, this is, for me personally, much less clear than it was when this whole thing started. And I think it's not decided yet how this will develop. What I can see at the moment is that, in my view at least, that tendencies leading into a situation where academics raise their voice about what's happening have increased and have become more important than before the crisis. And it's, and that's what, sorry. Go.
Pardon, no, sorry.
No, go ahead, Barbara.
I think, I mean, you absolutely rightly picked up on some ambivalence that I have, which I won't deny. So on the one hand, I try to do what's expected, right? On the other hand, I feel the same restlessness that if I understand you correctly, I hear. But one thing I wanted to add, I think that those of us, and it concerns the three of us here, and others who have a permanent post, who don't have to, you know, their livelihoods don't depend on evaluations, we have a stronger moral obligation to speak out, I think, and to do things. Then I would not expect the same thing from somebody who's still worried about getting a permanent job and getting tenure and finding an academic job in the first place.
Maybe let me up the ante, if I may, Nikolaus, but just, I think one insight that's beginning to grow is that the universities are part of the same problem that led us here. I'm not saying that they created a pandemic, but they're part of the structural preconditions that created all the problems that we describe in our book and for which we try to find solutions. I think it's more the case in the universities in Anglo-Saxon countries, but also countries like the Netherlands. And what we see there is, on the one hand, that their business model, and they have become businesses, so I choose my words carefully. So the business model is based on rather brutal exploitation of young academics, both financially and otherwise. A draconian audit system. So you spend, I don't know how much time. I already mentioned the research excellence framework, but there's also the the teaching excellence framework. So you spend enormous amounts of time telling other people how brilliant you are and what you did, as Barbara mentioned. And then you have to teach to a group of young people who have been led to believe that they are customers of yours and no longer students who are interested in getting an education or develop themselves while you are their mentor. And I have become very skeptical that this is a viable model. I mean, the businesses will probably keep existing, but the output of those university businesses I have grave doubts about.
Yeah, which brings me to a very fundamental question here, if I may, which is a book then the right instrument or the right tool? Wouldn't it be to go out and, I mean, there is, for example, a political debate ongoing literally today on the reform of the Austrian university system and the law on the Austrian universities, the Universitätsgesetz. And there's plenty of stuff in this law that many people are very upset about, because it might again bring younger academics into a position where they are even less secure and less safe than they could be at the moment in career planning, etc. So there would be there is plenty of opportunity out there to raise our voices, not necessarily in a book. And I would assume this is not only true for the university system, but it's also true for many of the other areas your book is about. So why did you decide then to write a book instead of, I don't know, doing a YouTube series, going into politics, I don't know, putting it on a blog somewhere, joining Fridays for Future, and so on? What is the difference, or what is the reason leading you to, okay, let's sit down and write 200 pages on the situation, and then let's see what the political system is doing with it?
I think I have a good answer to that. Namely, we did not decide to write a book. Okay. We do many, not all of the other things that you mentioned. So yeah. I'm not thinking of going into politics, but we do a lot of other things too. Blogs and practical, trying to support practical change, working with citizen initiatives and so on. And the genesis of this book was actually a blog. Yeah. So it was a blog that was also by some younger colleagues of ours, and not academics, but youth organizations. They also made videos around some of the themes. And then I don't actually recall when the exact moment was. Maybe Henk recalls that, but at some point we thought, we have to push ourselves to expand it into a book, because it's relatively easy to get your anger and frustration out and to write a blog not only about what's going wrong, but how things should be. But then when you have to spell out the details, this kind of more tedious work is, I think, necessary. Not because we think we have all the solutions and now we wrote the book and others are implementing it, but for those of us who, and these are not only academics but practitioners and young people who want to engage more in depth with some of the topics, you can much more easily enter a dialogue if you have it out in a book length form. So what pains me about the book is that we haven't found a way to make that open access. And I'm still determined to find a way to not have a cost barrier there. But I think it needed that longer form of a book. So I would absolutely agree that this is not the only, maybe not even the best way of communicating it, but maybe we also needed it just to structure our own thinking and where we go forward from here, how we go forward from here. I'm sure that Henk wants to add something.
First of all, Nicolaus, I think it's a very, very legitimate question, and that we should take seriously, and we address it in a way in the final chapter of the book, where we talk at some length about the crucial role of civil society in the next few years. And we saw today again how pressure from civil society has put these horrible deportation stunts of this government on the agenda, and I hope it stays on the agenda now and leads to something better. But there are three reasons. So that's a bit slightly less defensive answer than Barbara gives. For me, there were three reasons why I think a book was appropriate here. The first is that a lot of the material we present in the various chapters is information or that not many people seem to have. You know, when we talk about the finance sector is a champion in deliberately keeping things secret and invisible. Same applies to a lot of what we say about the corporate sector, or where does this weird idea come from that everything government does is inefficient and the business sector is so brilliantly efficient. That idea has a history, and we unearth that history, we bring it forward. So it's just information giving is one goal of this book, and I think you can do that better in a book than in probably other formats. Blogs, we wrote the blogs, as Barbara says, but we needed a bit of space to actually explain it. The second is the purpose of the book, as my good friend Patsy Healy also noted, who read the manuscript, is that we want to change the discourse on these issues. And a good way to do that is to have a kind of manifesto in the background where we present the terms of the discourse and say why these are better than the old discourse. And we hope actually that we have a bit of an illusion, maybe, that people who write party programs can take chunks out of the book and use it and maybe improve their promises to the public somewhat. And the third reason is we wanted to restore the belief in the importance of utopian thinking, because that's, you know, this society is now so efficient. You know, the emphasis is always on efficiency, on utility. Young people are supposed to train themselves for the world of occupations and programs that do not have an immediate payoff at the university are the first ones to be axed in times of budget cuts. So, but it's so important to keep that flame of utopian thinking alive. And with utopian thinking, as we explain in the book, we don't mean spinning fairy tales or you know, being totally impractical. In fact, we give an example of how such a utopian vision led the city administration of during the times of Das Rote Wien, and how important that vision was in the formulation and the implementation of all their policies. So those were the three goals, and I think a book is a good vehicle to do that, to attain those three goals.
Yeah. Let me just clarify. I didn't want to be offensive, and I hope that that Barbara didn't need to be defensive then. But the question I would like to rephrase the question in another way, perhaps more provocatively now. I fully understand part one, which is inform the audience. I also fully understand part two and part three, and in particular, I appreciate part three. So the utopian. I mean, it's evident when reading this that this is a kind of romantic, in the best positive sense, utopia, how things could become better, and why it is necessary that things should become better and will become better, hopefully will become better. And I think we should also go through the details then in a later stage of this conversation about the different areas you're talking about. And the Rote Wien and the housing issue is one of the important ones. Interestingly, very early in the book, by the way, So one of the first chapters is about the housing. But the question now is the following. Is it true that it's, or what could be done to get the second goal, which is people writing party programs should read this and should understand this and should put this into day-to-day politics? How is it possible to achieve this in the political system in which we are at the moment? And is a book the best tool for this, or does it need additional work? And if so, what is the additional work? Is it then holding conversations like this one here? Hopefully somebody's listening to this and then reading the book and then being inspired by this, or does the system need more pressure, more voices, more whatsoever, and more YouTube, more Twitter, whatsoever, in order to get this done? I mean, to get people who are in the position to change party programs to do that.
So my answer to this is that I'm not really sure what it takes, but I can say what we do, or what I do. So I'm doing evening events now every day on certain aspects of not to promote the book, but so not around the book, I should say. Yeah. Of course, I would like to promote the book, but not around the book as such, but specific aspects, the future of work, solidarity in healthcare, and so on and so on. With people who range from political party members, functionaries, to young people who are interested in climate change or housing. Do I think the easiest way is to convince people who write party programs? I don't think that's a very effective way, actually. I think too many parties are too dependent on opinion polling nowadays. And I think that as long as the pressure from below is not mounting, nothing much will change. However, the pressure is already mounting. The question is what it will be channeled into. And here I hope, maybe Henk thinks differently about that, but I hope that I can convince some people who are willing to also, who are looking for specific ways and specific solutions, we can convince of the direction in which we need to go. Because I'm not so sure that we've nailed all the solutions. I'm pretty sure we've nailed the direction.
Yeah. It's an issue, and that is probably one of the great issues of our times. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the great social revolutions of the last 150 years, I mean worker rights, voting rights for women in particular, civil rights issues in the United States in the 60s and before, then you see that there was an enormous, long build-up in society of people who articulated positions, who argued for improvements. But it only happened when some of those ideas and positions were institutionalized. Often that was through political institutionalization. It could be through unions. But at some point there was you could say the power to act congealed in political institutions. That's why, although I'm almost dismissive of party politics at the moment, and I don't think political parties are probably the only vehicle for this, but we cannot do without. And we have to again build up that pressure, and it's happening already, of course, in all sorts of domains, to get that crystallization point of institutionalization. And particularly this has to happen in the climate field now, because if we don't act soon, then it will be too late for all of us. And So that means, as I already said, lots and lots of activity in civil society, not just one thing, but everything. And now we have the advantage of social media, which makes it a little bit easier, but also more difficult. But so that would be my take on it. Yeah.
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 Perhaps, if I may, I would like to ask you about how you chose and how you decided on the different fields that you write about in the book, and also about the order of the different fields that appear there. Because it, as I said already, it starts with infrastructure, which is important and interesting to be the first one. Then it's about housing, then it's work, then it's governance or government, then it's corporate responsibility, and then there's a very long chapter, or relatively long chapter, about money, and then finally all this comes together in 2 chapters about a sustainable society and an ecological society. So this is the storyline. And the question I have is there certainly there is, and would you like to share with us your thinking about the order of the different topics and why in this order? And then I will ask you a second question, which is, from my background, which is law and IT and digitalization and all this, I would have expected a chapter on digitalization, which is not there, but it's more in between somewhere. And that would be my second question, why this?
Well, I leave that part to Barbara. That's okay. I can say a little bit about the order of the chapters and why these chapters.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do some backward mapping. So we felt that the final chapter, or the apotheosis, as it were, should be the climate chapter, because this is the issue we have to solve collectively, globally, and also, of course, on all the different local levels in the world, very, very soon. So, and then the question is, what prevents us from doing that? If I go backwards, well, one big obstacle is the global financial sector. So if you read the work of the South African economist Ann Pettifor, she's very clear in showing, and that fact was a big part of the first Green New Deal plan, which was written by her and some colleagues of hers in 2007, the New Economics Institute, I think this was, or the foundation, I always mix them up. She said, we need to reform the global financial sector because these guys, with all this mobile capital, they will just pull capital out of any country that is doing things that they don't like. And then, green initiatives might fail. If we then go back another step, we come at the corporate sector, which talks a good talk about corporate social responsibility. But if you look carefully into it, there's not much happening in that area. In fact, the opposite. We see monopolistic practices. We see massive tax evasion, again, on a global scale. We see exporting labor is so common now that we don't even question it. That's why we start with that fascinating case of the Cadbury plant in the UK that lays it out in great detail. Then we have arrived, I'm still going backwards, at the government chapter. We felt that should be in the middle. It's a pivotal chapter because we need government, just as we need, as I said earlier, if we institutionalize all those impulses, at some point government needs to channel it and design collective solutions backed up by law and the Rechtsstaat. And there we have serious problems, and that we try to describe that and suggest we give some suggestions of how to improve it. And then we come to the parts that we feel are important because of the pandemic, because so many ordinary people have gotten into huge problems because their income disappeared, their jobs disappeared, their businesses go bankrupt. And for that to, and we see very clearly that countries, for example, that don't have a clear, good social infrastructure, the people in those countries suffer much more than they do, for example, in Austria, where there's at least some, support. compared to the United States. So we need to talk there in those first chapters about the social infrastructure, which is also healthcare and public transport, a good housing, because if you lose your house, then everything ends from and work, the hollowing out of work, the precariousness of the position of the working class at the moment. So there are sort of there's other logics to be obviously that we could have applied, but this was the thinking that went into it.
Yeah, I see.
And I think one thing to add here before I address the question about digitalization is that one of the key arguments we make in response to the question of why we as a society haven't addressed those problems earlier on, because many of those problems have been well known and even solutions had been hammered out, as Henk was just saying. So one of the answers is that that those issues those changes can only be made when they're made together.
Yeah.
So I think that's important to emphasize that. It's like if you turn one little wheel in this machinery is not a good metaphor. Actually, we argue against the machine metaphor. We promote the gardening metaphor. So I will use a gardening metaphor now. If you change the plants that you grow in one part of your garden, then the rest of the garden will change as well. And I think one of the big fallacies in addressing, or one of the big problems in addressing climate change is, as is well known, that it is taken as a policy field as if it could be detached from others and it could be addressed in itself. So we're saying we have to address all of those 7 areas together. And we could have probably written a chapter on digitalization. I didn't think it was necessary because this is such a foundational, not only a technology, but a foundational practice of our age, either by its presence or by its absence, because it shapes the distribution of power, agency, resources. It exacerbates inequalities within societies, also globally, and so on and so on. It's involved in all of the aspects that we discuss and all of the policy fields that we discuss in the book. Infrastructure, very, very obviously and tangibly, in the sense that, for example, we think that that Wi-Fi infrastructure and mobile communication infrastructure should be part of public services that are being provided free at no cost to citizens, no cost at the point of use to citizens, and so on. But obviously, digital technologies are involved also in the future of work, very clearly. It's part of the problem, and it is part of the solution. In good government, especially also when we think about money, money is already something primarily digital. So it's part of all of those areas. So it would have seemed very, very artificial to take it out. Also because the book is a bit structured, of course, or the topics that we organize the book around, they do roughly correspond with policy fields that also have their budgetary pots where budgets and responsibilities and budgeting responsibilities are aligned with certain policy fields. So maybe that's because we are policy scholars, and we could have done it differently. We could have done it around capabilities. We could have done it around practical aspects of practical living, but we probably organized it more strongly along different policy fields.
I see. Perhaps let me ask one question, because you mentioned this Wi-Fi and access issue in the public infrastructure. This is something where I can obviously relate very well with as a lawyer, because there's so much debate on this also in the legal domain, and the typical lawyer's approach to this would be, okay, there were all kinds of directives from the European Union coming from 2002. They were then reformed after a very lengthy and complex debate in the European Electronic Communications Code, which was then put into force, I think, in 2019, 18, and then needs to be transposed into the national system in 27 different member states, leading to political debates in 27 different member states, leading to proposals for laws which are 250 pages long, and nobody wants to read them and nobody understands them, and they are extremely complex. And then finally ending up in a law which will certainly have very brutal consequences on a basic infrastructure, which is access to the internet, obviously. And it again brings me to the question then, how do you see such a book in this system? Or on the other way, what is the problem that you see in this very, very complex process of daily policy making, leading into a situation that will finally end up again in a bargaining situation between different stakeholders, because there's or lobby groups or interest whatever, political parties, take whatever you want. I mean, certainly not the debate that you would expect in this field. And I'm still struggling with the question how we can transpose this into our day-to-day lawmaking process.
So I'm not sure that I have a good question. A good answer to the question about the digitalization aspect specifically, but in terms of infrastructure, there's now a movement originating in the United Kingdom that's called the Movement for Universal Basic Services. So lots of continental Europeans find that a bit odd, because that's what a lot of continental Europeans have, namely publicly provided education that is free at the point of use or relatively inexpensive, some kind of legacy of social housing, healthcare that is relatively good quality, and so on and so on. So in the UK, many of those things are no longer there. And this has led to a debate that actually bounced off the universal basic income debate, because people said people should get a universal basic income, and then others said, well, maybe paying people money is the wrong idea. Maybe we should give people infrastructures and public services. So that has found entrance into some of the Corbyn campaigns, and of course we know how that ended. But still, so those ideas nevertheless proliferate. And what I've now observed from a distance, admittedly, because I have lived in Austria for the last 3 years, but some of those ideas, they not only linger, but they also change the baseline. So they change the baseline in that there's now among wider groups of progressively thinking people, Greens, lefties, but going into the political center, the idea that having services that are well funded and provided by the public is actually a good thing. And this is not a return to, central planning by the state, but the state coordinates and makes sure that the funding is there, and make some rules for equitable provision and delivery. So the baseline is shifting from thinking of everything that private businesses do is much more efficient and wonderful, to, well, maybe there's something good about fundamental needs not being satisfied at the free market. Maybe there's something good about that. So the baseline is shifting. Do I think that our proposals should or could be, as translated into concrete policies in the next 5 years? I don't think so. And maybe, with the exception of climate change, maybe some of them actually shouldn't be rushed. Maybe we should have a more fundamental rethinking of how we want to deal with housing, whether housing stock should be something that people speculate with, And maybe there should be a human right to decent, stable housing space at no cost at the point of use. So those kinds of things, they can't be rushed. My goal is more to shift the baseline, with the exception, as I mentioned, the climate crisis. We don't have the luxury to wait a few years and maybe 10 years to change the baseline. But what I'm saying is, with the exception of climate change, where we mostly draw upon and bundle ideas that other people have put out, so didn't take our original ideas about how to fight climate change. It's more that we weave it into how it relates to other policy fields. But my goal is not to have this translated into policy in the next 5 years. My goal is to change how people think about it and then act about it. But again, it might be that Henk has a different hope and goal here.
Well, maybe just a short, I'm not an expert on digitalization like Barbara is, but many of the problems we're facing is that this beautiful tool is in the hands of a few global monopolists who are driven by the dictate of shareholder value maximization. It is, and this is another example of how things hang together. This is one of the big messages of the book, that everything hangs together, which we capture in the term complexity. So why is it that to use internet, I have to provide all my personal details, most of them unwillingly? And why is it that with those personal details, those big global behemoths are making money by selling advertisements, which I then get back into my inbox or people trying to sell me useless stuff, which is actually very bad for our environment. So a lot of the problems with digitalization, why we need 250-page laws, I think, and I'm not even talking about the privacy issue of all this, is that we could do it differently if it was, and if we could get those big global behemoths to behave differently and maybe break them up, which I understand is now at the moment, at least on the agenda in the US Congress. So.
Two questions coming out of this. The first one is, I mean, one of the aspects that I find very interesting in your book is that you are in some parts evaluating the situation in different countries, or saying something. So, for example, you are very positive, and you also said it in this debate here now. You're very positive about the original Rotes Wien idea of housing politics in this country, and you put it into relation with the situation in the UK, also the situation as it is today, and I wonder whether you would do this. Whether you would be willing to do this in all the different chapters, right? So whether you would be okay if somebody else tried to take the book as a source for some kind of an evaluation scheme about how different European societies deal with the issues that you are mentioning in the book, such as housing or work or good government, and or digitalization, just to take the one that we mentioned last. Because I think one of the standard policy outcomes of the European Commission in my field would be that they end up with a chart saying Europe is here, Asia is there, the US is here, and within Europe, this country is here and this country is there, and let's go into the right direction. Would you feel comfortable with somebody taking your book in this way and taking it as a scheme for evaluation?
You want to start, or shall I?
You can, okay.
Yeah. I would be less comfortable, to be honest, because I don't think all of the issues are decided on a national level. Housing is obvious, and many of those comparisons have been made. Healthcare is another obvious one, and lots of books are around doing just that. But I think the problems in government are already, well, some of them are not determined by national issues. A lot of it is, of course, but not everything, as we already explained in our chapter. And then the corporate and the finance chapter, those are just, global issues. So I would find it difficult to rank countries on those issues, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The corporate part, if you take the last chapter that we spoke about, or the last aspect that we spoke about, this, the internet giants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a huge attempt from Europe at the moment to attack those by two huge new laws called Digital Services Act and Digital Market Act. And the purpose of this is trying to get them compliant with European values in a way, right? Although they are US-based companies, obviously. And that's an interesting approach, I would say, from a European perspective, at least. And it's one of the very big approaches taking place at the moment to enforce European values, just like in the GDPR. That was another attempt, perhaps, in the field, the data protection regulation, where Europeans also try to educate the world in a way how data protection should look like. And one could, and that's a European example, but I could also find probably nation state examples into this phenomenon. And the question I would then have would be, as I said, is there something in the book to evaluate those approaches?
Well, I have a different answer to this than Henk, although I see where he's coming from, but I wouldn't mind if people who liked the general ideas went through the chapters and looked and saw it as some kind of grid that we can apply to societies to see how they map against the ideal case. I mean, there are approaches out there, such as these evaluation schemes for businesses and economies for the common good, the gross domestic happiness product. So there are different ways of making, of quantifying something that is an alternative good from the goods for which we have standard economic metrics for. And they are necessarily all flawed. And some people would even say we shouldn't put a number to certain things, to happiness or to well-being or health even, and we shouldn't squeeze a complex phenomenon such as happiness into a tick box. I see their point, but I disagree. I think what's not countable doesn't count very often. And although it is certainly not my mission and our mission with this book to provide a sort of tick box exercise where you at the end get a score for each country, I wouldn't mind if people used it as I said, as a kind of grid to look to look at specific cases at through this particular lens. And I think you mentioned the Digital Services Act and other legislative and regulatory initiatives by the European Union. I mean, that wouldn't map against the chapters of the book, but I think this is a very interesting development nevertheless that speaks to some of the topics that we address in the book, because what happens if at the end of the day some of the behemoths are broken up? What if? And then maybe Europe will have in some contexts platforms that have a different ownership model, in that they are collaboratively owned by citizen cooperatives. And I don't think that this is the solution for everything. I'm not anti-business, but I think that this extreme concentration of power, so that, to use Frank Pascale's term, those corporations have stopped being market participants, but they've become market regulators, is probably something that Europe shouldn't stomach. And that definitely speaks to the spirit of associative democracy that we discuss in the book, harnessing citizen initiatives, harnessing cooperatives which we don't do enough across Europe. And if somebody said, okay, if one country provides a more fertile ground for those citizen initiatives, also in the digital domain, than others, provides financing instruments to citizens who have good ideas, which is a big problem in Europe and worldwide. If somebody then used the book to assess that, I would be quite happy.
And if I asked you to assess the Austrian corona politics since March, using the book as a grid, would there be anything that you would like to, emphasize positively or negatively, where Austria is in particular not following the approach that you would suggest, or is very well doing in following the approaches that you suggest?
Well, I will just pick two, one good and one bad, maybe. So Austria does, of course, still have many of the public infrastructures and services that are still properly funded that other countries do no longer have. And one of the reasons that the pandemic has hit us, especially in the earlier phases, less badly as other countries, is, good healthcare, but also relatively stable housing. So people don't. People's health status is on average better than in other countries. Those kinds of things. So here Austria is doing relatively well. Where it's not doing well is anything having to do with making adequate steps towards a more sustainable society, especially also the combination of social and other types of justice, such as environmental justice. I don't think that many members of the Austrian government have even heard about that. And I think here that is actually the responsibility of politics, to not only deal with the issues that are the most urgent for the people now. And I don't mean to belittle that. There are very urgent problems, but also think about the more structural things, such as reducing inequalities in the background, reducing inequalities, taking steps towards solving the climate crisis, and so on and so on. And here I would say that the Austrian situation is not particularly good at the moment, despite the having a Green Party in government.
Maybe I should relieve Barbara here a little bit and give the perspective from an outsider, because I started to live here in October 2017. And it's really an interesting story, I think. And this is also, I can also say a little bit about the scorecard approach, because I still don't like it. And the reason is that I think we are much better off trying to tell coherent stories, give coherent narratives of how a country is doing in all these aspects. It's a bit like in my very olden days when I was still a psychologist. You saw there were two ways to diagnose psychiatric patients. One was with a scorecard, and one was the more psychoanalytic narrative approach. And the last one always was much, much, much more informative. Anyway, Austria, as Barbara said, I think the country is doing very well in comparison with other countries in terms of social infrastructure, housing, also probably some income support, although there's a lot of criticism here. Where it is doing very badly is in the political field, and it shares that disgrace, you could say, with a number of other countries such as the Netherlands and the UK. These are all countries, including Austria, that are governed by ideology and not by evidence or the best knowledge in uncertain situations, or a willingness to reach out to social partners and political adversaries to help us get through these difficult times in a more consensual way. It's also a problem, and it's the same in the Netherlands, that politics is beholden to very powerful interests. In the Netherlands, that's the finance industry and some of the big transnational global corporations, Shell, Unilever, and so on, that have much more influence over over political decision making than anything else. In Austria, it's the skiing industry and the real estate industry, you name it. So this is, I think, where this country scores particularly bad, to the point that it is almost corrupt. So Austria is sliding down the corruption index in the world at the moment. Very, very worrisome development. And there is not enough, there is a lot, but not enough pressure from below to give some counterweight, like decent prosecutions of clear corruption cases, among other things. And there are a couple of floating around at the moment. Another great strength of this country is its public administration, and particularly still in Vienna, which is the legacy of Das Rote Wien, I think is. So you can tell a good story, and I think the story would reveal where the strengths and the weaknesses are, and where we should probably provide recommendations or see where we can intervene. But and another strength in this country is still civil society and the rechtsstaat. So those things, I think, we should cherish, and sadly, I don't think the political parties are sufficiently open to some of these strengths in Austria.
Yeah,
that's my take.
Yeah. Let me just clarify. I'm very much with you when with your skepticism against scorecards as a basis. But I just, I mean, I see that scorecards are taken very frequently when people debate on the on the outcome of this whole crisis. And in particular, in day-to-day politics, they are doing this, right? So it's, I mean, sometimes I have the feeling that I'm reading, I don't know, a ski race results when it's about death rates in different countries. And it's a typical approach to say the Germans are doing better, or the Dutch are doing worse in this or that in dealing with the pandemic. I completely agree with you that this is not the appropriate approach. Yeah. But still, it's an approach that is our day-to-day experience, I think.
But why does it have to be either or? I mean, I would agree with Henk that if I had to pick one or the other, yes, I mean, a narrative qualitative evaluation is always much better, but almost always. But as long as that takes place, why not also have another tool? So I don't think that is so dangerous.
No, I think I'm sorry to intervene. I think it's I wouldn't call it dangerous, but it has a tendency to be simplistic, right?
Yeah.
And that's why it's used so frequently, I think, because it's so easy to say this or that is better or worse here or there, right? And it's
But it can also be done in a very intelligent way. So I wrote a blog earlier on in the first lockdown about this French fellow Thomas Pueyo. I'm not sure if I pronounce his name properly, who gives us these fantastically written blogs full of data, but he organizes the data in such a way that it answers our most pressing questions. So if you don't know him, I suggest you look him up. He has now a series of blogs, and that's the way to do it, and not those very, as you rightly say, very simplistic scorecards that we see in the newspapers.
Yeah. And I also want to say that I very much share your concern about the corruption and the ranking of Austria in the corruption scorecards that are out there, right? So although this might be simplistic, it's a reason for concern. I think it's a very serious reason for concern.
And it's always the question is why? Huh? What is the background to this? Why is it that the Netherlands, which is a highly developed, very rich, and in normal circumstances actually quite a nice place to be, fails so miserably in managing the COVID crisis? It doesn't. It's not in the news so much now with the riots. It is, but it's not doing much better in the UK. Really, it's why is that? It's a puzzle, and we need to have answers to those puzzles.
Yeah, and I say that was a really frustrating moment for me 2 or 3 days ago when I started to read a little bit more about those riots in Amsterdam and the other
Well, Amsterdam is fine, actually. It's mostly outside of Amsterdam.
Cities, so that's already part of my incompetence here.
No.
Why is completely, I mean, I can't, I mean, how should I understand this, right? So it would probably take me, I don't know, years to fully understand the picture. And this reminded me a lot of your idea of complexity in the book, right? Because it's so complex to understand those things. And I don't know yet how to deal with this complexity, right? So if I needed to get an answer on why is this happening in the Netherlands at the moment, that people are rioting because of, as I was told, because of the lockdown, I would need years to understand that, wouldn't I?
Yeah. But here I think this is where complexity can come in a useful way. So I have colleagues who are very worried about anyone using the word complexity, because especially in the context of environmental catastrophes in the US, it has been used politically to say, you know, everything is complex, so it's nothing we can do, right? And that's, of course, exactly not what we mean. What we mean by complexity is to emphasize that certain things are merely complicated, but others, and this is the example that you gave now, they are complex in the sense that we might be able to identify certain factors in a situation that have bearing on, that shape the situation, but there are properties that emerge from the interaction of these factors. So we can't say, so any kind of linear reasoning can't help us understand the situation. We can't just say social deprivation and a corona pandemic means riot. It's not that, because it's probably a relative, and Henk is maybe the best placed as a Dutchman to give us hints as to what the emergent properties are. But seeing something through the complexity lens means to also assume a position of humility, to say that, I mean, as Sheila Jasanoff always says, it's a position of humility in the sense that we know we cannot control in a way that an engineer controls a situation, a social situation, but we try to see what the emergent properties are that come from the interaction of certain factors. And I think that is the strength of a complexity approach.
In this particular example, actually, I don't think is much of a, it's not such a complicated problem. Complicated is different from complexity. And I quote the great Dutch popular philosopher Johan Cruyff, who was, as you know, one of the greatest football players ever, who always says every strength has its weakness and you can always turn it around. So that's the strength of his philosophy. Everything he says you can turn around. But the riots were there long before the pandemic. If you on an average Saturday night, not in Amsterdam so much, but in most other cities and small towns in the Netherlands, young people tended to be unruly, and sometimes it would, you know, blow up into a riot, and they would attack the police if the police started to intervene. So this is more of it. But now it is in the context of a pandemic and of a curfew. And suddenly there's all these explanations, like it has something to do with deprivation or with people being angry about the curfew. No, I think it was a good occasion to do some more rioting, and as one of my colleagues called it, engage in recreational violence. And that's probably what it was.
Which is also interesting then, because this is a very different story from what you read in German-speaking media about it, right? So that's not about recreational rioting. It's more about fundamental issues in a breaking society, right? So,
no, I think you can say that, but I doubt it, to be honest. And the Dutch approach to these Saturday night, what is it, ruckus, is usually to contain it a little bit. Don't go in with full force. Try to contain it. If it gets too bad, you arrest a few people.
Well, but I think it's important to not belittle the problem that in the Netherlands, as in many other countries, there are lots of people who feel that the authorities for decades and years have not really protected and fought for their interests, but for other people's interests. And they have this kind of against authority identity for partly good reasons. The problem with this analysis is that very often this is where the analysis stops. Having these problems, feeling left behind, rightly or wrongly, but to a large extent rightly, doesn't explain why people riot. It doesn't explain why people adhere to conspiracy fantasies. There's much else. A lot of other things are going on here, and some of the other things that are going on here, Henk just described.
Yeah, and I think the people who feel left behind, and there are many in the Netherlands, because it suffered brutally from austerity and since the last financial crisis, those are not the people who riot. This is not a Gilets jaunes riot. This is something else entirely. Much more along the lines that I just tried to explain.
Interesting. Interesting, because one of the associations that I had when we started this part of the conversation was exactly the French movement, right? And how far this is to be compared or not to be compared. And that could also then be compared again with the Austrian situation as we have it at the moment. But then again, we would probably end up with scorecards, and this is what we want to avoid here. So let me briefly come to an end with a very stupid but very important question to all those out there, for all those out there who are in the writing process. How did you manage your writing? Did you write the chapters together, or did one of you take one and the other one was editing, or how do you do this, and how did you survive this process?
So did you just say in the rioting mode? Or right? That's what I heard.
Yeah.
So we one of us drafted some chapters and the other person drafted the others, and then we swapped. I think that is a very good method to not end up with a book that has two voices that sort of don't come together. So I have co-authored books in the past, and in my experience, that's a very good way of doing it. Not to say you write chapter 1, I write chapter 2, but actually to have, clearly some chapters Henk drafted, and some chapter I drafted, and then the other person contributed less, but we tried to make it a joint voice rather than two voices interacting. And I think for this, it's very important that nobody who's involved in the writing process feels narcissistically hurt when the other person touches their writing. So I can't write with people who are upset when I change what they write. And I'm totally not touchy about this either. When somebody takes out one paragraph, two paragraphs, a whole page of what I wrote, which happened a lot with Henk, sometimes just took out a whole chapter and said, but I'm not hurt. And I think that makes me someone who enjoys working with other people, writing with other people, except those that really don't care about deadlines. And that was a bit of a sore point with us.
So there's a different approach in how strict deadlines are.
I wanted to say something nice, but I'm not sure I'm going to do it. But no, I think for me, it's important that the partner with whom you write, you admire and trust that partner. And that was definitely the case. And I don't think the deadlines were an issue at all. We finished the whole manuscript in 3 months and on time. And the publisher was happy.
So remarkably quickly. I mean, this is astonishing, because it's it's almost 200 pages text, or more than 200 pages if you take the notes and all this, and this within 3 months. And it's really, I mean, that is per se already impressive. And I'm really.
Some people would say, well, it shows.
No, not at all. No, because I also want to emphasize once more that it was one of the probably the most inspiring book that I read on the whole situation in which we are in, since I started reading about all this in the last month and years. So it's really, really impressive because of its timeliness and its precision and its depth, and it's so for me it was really a very, very impressive reading experience, and I'm very grateful for this privilege to have read it prior to the audience, and the general public is going to read it hopefully in summer. That's the last news that I heard. And I'm very sure that it will have an impact on the debate in Austria and abroad, on how to deal with the big topics of our society at the moment, not only but also from a legal perspective. And I want to thank you for this, for the book, and also for the time that you spent with me here. Is there anything I should have asked you that you still want to share with our audience on the book, or on any of my stupid questions?
Well, first of all, many thanks for inviting us again, and for your words of praise. We're very happy and to hear that from you, a scholar we both admire very much. We could talk for another 2 hours easily, but we won't do it. So I think it's okay to, as far as I'm concerned, to stop here, and maybe there will be other opportunities to have a conversation in another fora. I don't know exactly, but I'm okay with. It's also the attention of the reader, the listeners will be sorely taxed if we continue, I think.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add. Thank you very much, Nicolas, for having us, and thank you to everyone who listened to us, and hopefully we continue this conversation outside as well.
Yeah, and to the people who listen and to this and watch it, feel free to get in touch. We love to broaden the conversation.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you to all those who are listening to us. Have a good evening. Please stay informed, stay in touch with us, and stay healthy or become healthy as quickly as possible. All the best to all of you. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.